big windows from hundreds of feet. Nobody got hurt, which was very fortunate. But the John Hancock Company was kind of upset. The building was falling apart, so they sued the architect. They sued I.M. Pei and Associates. They want to take them to court. Turned out that I.M. Pei and Associates was insured by the John Hancock Company, so they didn't go to court. They fixed it. The building didn't have enough give in it, so the windows were like popping out. The people at MIT figured this out. I'm always glad there were smarter people than me in the world. But the windows didn't have it. They had to loosen up. That's the message of this, is we need to loosen up sometimes, okay? Because it was just popping out. Handsome duck boat coming up on the left over here. There we are, Annie Aquarium. How about a quack? You ready? Von Trivia.
Quack, quack.
Right, we're getting there. Copley Square on the right, named after John Singleton Copley. He was a famous portrait artist before the Revolution. But the square was originally called Art Square because the Museum of Fine Arts was on the corner on the left up until 1910. In 1910, they built a new museum about a mile down the road on Huntington Avenue, so they changed the name of the square. This is where the captain turns us into the Harry Potter bus at this point. Almost. Good job, Captain. But the hotel, it opened in 1912, but they had to delay the opening because it was going to open early in the year, but they didn't have enough furniture because a lot of their furniture had been shipped over from England on the Titanic. So they lost it, so they had to get new stuff to replace the old stuff. The library on the right over here, the Boston Public Library, that's the oldest public lending library in the United States. And the largest. They have over 10 million books at the Boston Public Library. And if you come from Massachusetts, they let you get a library card. You don't have to live in Boston, you can live anywhere in the state. And if you get a library card, you can borrow 75 books at a time. 75. But if you don't bring them back in time, they put your name on the side. That's what all these names are. Those are all the people with overdue books right there. They've been there a long time, too. They really should get some of those books back. But it's like an art museum in there. It really is. It's a beautiful building. It was designed by Charles Fowlin McKim. It opened in 1895. And it's got all kinds of murals by John Singer Sargent. It's got sculptures by St. Gaudens. It really is. It's a beautiful building. Old South on the right, 1875. That's a beautiful church. It's a congregational church. It's New Old South, as opposed to Old South, which is down on Washington Street. That's where they had the big meeting for the Tea Party in 1770. But see the tower? The bell tower, that was the Leaning Tower of Boston, because when they built it, it started to sink into the ground. Because remember, this is landfill, so the ground's kind of soft. So they took it down and put it back up again, but it's 16 feet shorter than it was originally. They sliced off the top part of it. So when they were building Trinity Church across the square here, the tower was going to be twice as tall. That was the original plan, but then they decided not to make it quite as heavy. They thought it would be too heavy, it would sink into the ground. But Trinity is a magnificent church. It was built by Henry Hobson Richardson. It opened up in 1878, and the American Institute of Architects calls Trinity Church one of the 10 most significant buildings in the United States. It's a beautiful building inside, too. It's very spacious. I feel like a real sense of spaciousness. MIT started right along here on Boylston Street. Not this building, though. That was the New England Mutual Life Insurance Company. But you know MIT, right? Millionaires in training. They started in Boston in the 1860s. They moved to Cambridge 1916. Built a new campus on the Charles River. But the original MIT building looked kind of like this one. This nice brick building here. That was built around 1870. That was the original Museum of Science. Okay, that was the Institute of Natural History. They built the new Museum of Science in the 50s, the 1950s, on the dam between Boston and Cambridge. We'll see that just before we go in the water. This is now Restoration Hardware today. Kind of a fancy hardware store, I think.
Yeah.
Here's Arlington Street Church on the left. You know, when they built the back bay, when they filled in all of this land, this was the first major building they constructed, the Arlington Street Church, 1859. It's a very active Unitarian congregation. Beautiful windows. They have 16 Tiffany windows at the Arlington Street Church. More than any other church. By Tiffany himself, too. Oh, ice cream. There's the public garden again. The oldest botanical garden in the United States. Oldest public botanical garden, I should say. But the swan boats, they've been there since 1870.
Swan boats? Yes.
I think they may have closed up shop for the day. I don't know. I don't think they're out. They start at 10. They end at 4:30. They only go out Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. They don't go out in the rain. I think ducks are much tougher than swans. I think so. But they were started by a man named Robert Paget. And originally, you know, Mr. Paget, he had rowboats on the public garden. You could rent a rowboat. But then he went to see the opera Lohengrin by Wagner. And at the end of Lohengrin, the hero is borne off on a boat pulled by swans. So he loved the idea of swans pulling a boat. So he started the swan boats back in the 1870s. You know, they're still run by his family today. The Paget family still runs the swan boats after all these years. It's a great tradition, it really is. We love our traditions in Boston, you know, swan boats, even duck boats are a tradition now in Boston. You know, Boston has the reputation, very liberal city. That's sort of our reputation, you know, very liberal, very progressive, but it's also very traditionalist as well. You know, we cling to our traditions, the old and the new. I think that's what makes Boston, Boston.
What is that?
Best of the old and the best of the new. When it works. When it doesn't work, it's the worst of the old and the worst of the new, you know, but that's the way history goes sometimes. You got to take the good with the bad. But this was the edge of the city. The Shawmut Peninsula ended at where the Common is today. That was the end of the city. The Puritans originally landed in Charlestown, you know, over to the east, but they couldn't drink the water in Charlestown. It was too salty. It was brackish. So in 1630, they left Charlestown. They came across the Charles River to the Shawmut Peninsula. And they named the Shawmut Peninsula Boston because most of them had come from Boston and Lincolnshire in central England. That was their hometown back in England. But they were invited over by kind of an odd duck. His name was William Blackstone. He lived where the Common is. He had a little farm. But he was a hermit. He lived all by himself. He was an Anglican minister. But he heard the Puritans were having trouble, so he invited them over. And then he changed his mind. He couldn't stand them. They started bossing him around, telling him what to do. So he went down to Rhode Island and he helped Roger Williams to start the Rhode Island colony. Here's Beacon Hill. Probably the most expensive neighborhood in the city. I think that's safe to say. There are no cheap neighborhoods left, but Beacon Hill's kind of pricey. But you can visit for free, you know. You go in a couple of blocks, you're back in the 19th century. It really is nice. Very shady, too. If it's free, it's for me. That's what I say. Here's the Somerset Club on the left. Very exclusive, you know. Hoity-toity, really. There was a fire at the Somerset Club, 1945. Firemen went to the front door to put out the fire. The butlers came to the door. They said, "I'm sorry, you're not members. Please use the servants' entrance." To the firemen, can you imagine? A little too exclusive, I think. So we're heading up to the top of the hill. The State House will be on the left, the Massachusetts State House. That was designed by Charles Bulfinch, probably the first great architect in America after the Revolution. John F. Kennedy on the left, our 35th president, one of 4 U.S. presidents from Massachusetts. But the State House was originally the property of John Hancock. He was a very wealthy merchant. And when he died, the state bought his property, and they had Charles Bulfinch put up the State House. Cornerstone was laid in 1795 by Paul Revere and Sam Adams. That's the Bulfinch entrance. They're doing some work on it, but that's the ceremonial entrance. You know, if the president comes to visit or a head of state, they'll open up the big doors. When the governor leaves office, they have something called the Long Walk, where the governor comes down the steps at the end of his or her term and goes out onto the common to show that they've become a common citizen once again. That's the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial on the right, the 54th Regiment of the American Civil War. You know, the first all-black regiment in American history. They fought at Fort Wagner in South Carolina. You know, if you saw the movie Glory, they were the ones that fought in Glory in the movie. General Hooker from the Civil War, General Joseph Hooker. This is Mary Dyer on the corner. Kind of a sad story, Mary Dyer. She was a Quaker. The Puritans didn't like Quakers. They kept throwing her out. She kept coming back. So finally they hung her. Oh, they were tough. But you know, one generation hangs you, the next generation puts you on the lawn of the State House. That's how history goes. So follow your conscience, okay? Live in truth. Amen. End of the sermon. Back to the tour. Highest point in the city on the left, that's the Bulfinch Column. That's a monument to the American Revolution. So that's the high point of our tour. It's all downhill from here. There we go. Down Bowden Street. This is as close as we get to a Disney ride right here. Pretend you're in San Francisco. Woo!